Dr. Michael Vitacco is our next guest. He's a forensic psychologist at the Medical College of Georgia at Augusta University. He's no stranger to the Means Report, and the reason that he's here today is because, as always, Dr. Vitacco and his team have their hands in some pretty fascinating research. The part of it that we're focusing on today deals with the criminally insane. When you've heard someone plead guilty by reason of insanity, what happens to them after that? Are they gone away forever? Can they be fixed? If so, how? What sort of resources are out there? What works, what doesn't? Well, that's what Dr. Vitacco and his folks have been looking at over at the Medical College of Georgia. It's yet another project that's put us on the map nationally and internationally. And Dr. Vitacco, I appreciate you being back with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
You know, one of the things that always strikes me when I'm sitting at a table with you is those that you've sat at a table with. You have looked during your forensic interviews into the abyss when you've looked into the eyes of some of these bad guys. People who've done horrible things.
People who've done horrible things.
And so we're trying to figure out how to make them not do horrible things.
That's right.
Correct?
Absolutely.
And I think I asked you this one or two visits ago. Aren't there some people who are unfixable, though? Aren't there some people who are just broken?
There probably are a few of those individuals.
A few?
Right.
All right.
And that's one of the reasons we're here today and been doing this research is that we have now looked at multiple states across the United States, including Georgia, and our results are really showing with these specific individuals who have been found not guilty by reason of insanity, they can do remarkably well when they return to the community.
What do you have to do to make sure that they do well? And when you say do remarkably well, do you mean go back to blending into society and being a normal person?
Quote unquote normal?
Yeah, quote unquote normal.
Yeah. No, that's exactly what the hope is that they spend some time in a hospital, they receive treatment, and then they go back into the community under supervision. And then what we have done is nationwide, we have followed over 1,000 of these individuals over the course of multiple states and have actually determined what they've done and how well they've done overall.
Is there a profile that you could describe that illustrates what an offender looks like, or these are all sorts of different kind of people?
All sorts of various different people across social economic status, various races and ethnicities. But the key is many of their crimes are the same. These individuals, 50% of them have actually committed a violent crime. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of stereotyped. The problem is that most of the stereotypes get wrong, is that these individuals are unfixable, there's nothing we can do for them. When in fact, if we put them on medication, follow them, treat their risk factors, and put them back in the community, they're much less likely to reoffend than your typical individual leaving a prison.
Are the TV shows pretty accurate in the sense that once someone is deemed not guilty by reason of insanity, they go away to a mental health facility for X number of months or years, and then they re-enter society slowly but surely?
That part is true, but I think where TV has gotten often very wrong is that they portray these people, as you said, unfixable,
right,
broken, and that there's almost no hope for them, and they're going to be violent all their lives. The fact is that most of these individuals never commit another violent crime, at least for the 7 to 10 years we've been following them.
Would you say that most of them, at least at first, when you first meet them, want to get better?
Most of them do, and once they start getting better, that actually starts like an effect where they keep getting better. Mm-hmm. So often, the issue has to be with medications, where they don't take their medications. So that's something we have to monitor, make sure they get them in the hospital. But then the key is make sure they get them when they return to the community.
When you say that someone is not guilty by reason of insanity, does it mean that they snapped just for a moment and committed the crime, or that they've been insane their whole lives?
Well, it actually is a combination of those things. I think one of the things we think of is that they just snapped or something went wrong. What it really means is they've been mentally ill for a long time, and usually significantly so, but at the time of the offense, they didn't know what was right from wrong. So that's a real key factor, is that's a very high bar. Most people who commit crimes, the large majority, really have the ability to differentiate right from wrong. And that's really a key factor. So we're talking less than 1% of the people who commit crimes are even considered for an insanity defense.
All right, so what does this approach look like? Let's take the viewer's view through a few of the steps that you take when you're trying to reform these folks. Sure. What do you do at first?
So first is a court hearing, obviously, and the judge or a jury finds them not guilty by reason of insanity. At that time, they come into a hospital, very much to what we have in Augusta, East Central Regional Hospital, but there's literally thousands of those hospitals across the country. Then they're given medications, they're monitored, making sure that they're compliant with their medications. They often go through a step system where they continue to get gradually more privileges. oftentimes that may even mean community visits. You'll see them out of the community with staff doing various things.
Can we identify them? I mean, am I going to run into one of these folks at the grocery store?
Probably.
How can I tell it's a criminal?
You won't be able to.
I'm sorry, I'm not guilty
Right.
by reason of it. Shouldn't call them a criminal.
Right.
You know, that's my bad.
No, that's all right.
But are they identifiable?
No.
Okay.
No. And then when they're ready, they usually go to a group home, and then often they go to a place that's still monitored, and we call that conditional release.
Right.
And what that means is they are released, but there's conditions upon their release. They have to take their medications. They're not allowed to own firearms. They can't use alcohol or drugs. If they start doing those things, they can actually be brought immediately back into the hospital.
Well, what usually makes them go back? Committing another offense or accidentally drinking again?
Well, it's usually not accidentally drinking, but one of the things, if they stop taking their medications, that's something we view very seriously. So if they become not compliant with their medication issues, and those issues arise, we bring them almost immediately back into the hospital.
How can you tell that they're violating that part of their release?
Well, that's part of the conditions, is that we have people monitoring them in the community to make sure they're taking their medications. And now with the advances in psychotropic medications, many of them get a shot. So it's one time every 30 days. So we know if they don't get their medications, if they don't show up, if they go AWOL. And that way we will issue an order and they'll be brought back into the hospital.
What about other conditions of their release that you can't monitor, that you can't observe with an injection? How can you really tell whether they're adhering to their conditions? Can't they trick you and deceive you in order to just get through the program and beat the system?
They could, but that's pretty hard because they are really structured. They are monitored. For example, if they have therapy programs they got to go to, their attendance is monitored, and you may not want to participate, but you'll know if they don't show up. We can screen them for drug and alcohol use. So if their drug screen pops, that would be another key where we would bring them back into the hospital.
How long does all this take, from the time they're in that courtroom to the time that you say, okay, you can go on back into society?
Right. Well, that's a great question, and the right answer to that, it really depends. Sometimes it's months. Sometimes it's 10, 20 years. It really depends on the individual, how well they respond to treatment, and as well as they're willing to work real hard to sort of focus on those communities. We actually have a couple guys in our hospital right now, and obviously can't name names, have no interest in leaving, and they're making that their home, and we can't make them.
Have you ever been wrong and put somebody back in society who should never have been?
No, not as of yet. Now, we certainly have been wrong in the fact that we put someone in society who's violated their conditions and have to come back. And that's hard enough, but we haven't been wrong where we've let someone go when they've committed a really serious, heinous murder or something like that. And that's something we want to be very careful of.
Are they not mentally ill, or are they not insane anymore when you're finished with them?
Well, insane is a legal term that strictly relates to their crime, but their mental illness, like all of us who have a medical condition, say for example you have diabetes, it goes up and down. As long as it's treated, they can remain relatively stable. Mental health is really the same way, is that if there's an issue, and long as they're on their medications, they can remain relatively stable for a really long time. Some of our folks have been out of the community for 20, 25 years, doing just fine, working, living, kind of living their lives.
What happened to these folks before research like the kind that you're describing was done? Where did they end up?
Well, initially when all these came about, is they would spend the rest of their life in a hospital, and there was no way they could get out. The Supreme Court has actually cleared the way through some decisions in the 90s that has kind of made states look at these things. But the other thing that's most importantly from a fiscal standpoint, it's much cheaper to treat someone in the community if you can do it safely and securely than it is to have them in a secure hospital, which is almost $1,000 a day.
What about your relationship with law enforcement? Do they like projects like this? Do they like efforts like those you undertake?
I hope so. I think they do. I mean, our relationship from that standpoint with law enforcement is always critical because we rely on them if there's a problem. If someone doesn't show up for their appointments, if they're not on their medications, law enforcement has to go get them.
Yeah.
So we keep very good relationships and obviously respect our colleagues in that area very, very strongly.
But you've had to testify in many, many criminal cases, and your testimony has led to people not being sent away to prison. It's led to not guilty verdicts, correct?
It has, but I want to point out very, very rarely.
Okay.
Very rarely. Out of the cases I supervise each year, which is probably close to 100, there's about 1 or 2 people from that thing that are found not guilty by reason of insanity. So it's a very, very small percentage.
How important are family members when it comes to this process you've described, making sure that the person completes the steps?
Well, ultimately, it relies on that person who has to do the steps. And what we often want is family members to be family members. We don't want them to be supervisors. We rely on them, but we have professionals in the community to do exactly what they're supposed to do, which is monitoring these individuals. The problem is when you get a family member in there, sometimes they're reluctant to tell you because they don't want to see their child, their father, their mother go back into the hospital. So we really rely on more quote unquote objective folks to make sure that those needs are getting met.
Just a couple more questions.
Sure.
What about the environment that these people end up in? My point is sometimes environmental factors
Absolutely.
help people commit crimes.
Right.
Do you have to remove them from those old environments a lot of times?
We often do, and that's one of the reasons why we supervise them so heavily. We put them in initially supervised placements where their lack of alcohol and substances are limited, where we make sure they get their medications, where there's no one telling them, hey, you don't really need this medication.
Right.
You're just fine.
Right.
Instead of saying, hey, this medication is here to help you, this medication is going to keep you free in the community. And those are the type of messages that these folks really need to hear.
You mentioned success stories 20, 25 years down the road. Are these folks ever released from you or released from observation?
They are.
Yeah?
They are. Not altogether frequently, but several times a year, someone is released from this type of supervision. Very, very similar to someone who's on probation and parole. They reach a certain point, they've been doing really well, they get off, and they're free to try again on their own.
You're like the second chance guy, aren't you?
Sometimes, right? We also, though, equally, we have a number of cases where I testify where I recommend that someone is responsible, and it often will lead to a lengthy prison term.
Well, you do some tough work, there's no question about it. And as I said at the beginning of the interview, you've looked across many tables and seen these folks firsthand. Thanks for the work you put in.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for taking the time to talk about this research. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's incredible research being done at the medical college. Dr. Vitacco leads the way, and he is a good guest on the Means Report, no question about that.